Welcome to the AVAIL podcast, where we dig deep and talk about the art of leadership. My name is Virgil Sierra, and today we're sitting down with Phil Cooke. Phil is a celebrated filmmaker, media consultant, founder of the Cooke Media Group, and an author. In this episode, we'll talk about his new book release, Church on Trial: How to Protect Your Congregation, Mission, and Reputation During a Crisis. Leaders, you're going to want to take some notes, so lean in and let's get started. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the AVAIL podcast, where we dig deep, talk about this art we call leadership. My name is Virgil Sierra, lead pastor of Vertical Church, aka Iglesia Vertical in South Florida. We are one church, two languages. I'm your host for this AVAIL podcast, where we talk leadership at a high level with global impacting leaders, pastors, authors, people who are just making an impact in the world. And today will not disappoint everybody. We got one of the friends of the house here at AVAIL. We got Phil Cooke back in the house here on the AVAIL podcast. Phil, I am honored. Our AVAIL audience is excited. Thanks for being back on the AVAIL podcast. How you doing?
Well, thank you, Virgil. It's always a thrill to be here. I love that whole AVAIL team. So this is going to be fun today.
Yeah, it's been awesome to see in these last years for me, not only to get to know you more and to have these opportunities to do podcasts, talk leadership, talk about the ideas that God has just put in your heart. And now you're putting them in books, getting them in hands of people, leaders, pastors, people in media. I just want to say, man, I love it. I am blessed by your books. I am blessed by your heart. And I know you don't need me to do this, but I just want to say, as a pastor, as somebody who cares about excellence and quality when it comes to, everything audio, visual, and media and communications, I think your voice is extremely important for the church. It's extremely relevant. So I just want you to know I'm a big fan, and we got a lot of AVAIL audience who's leading in every time you're joining in, and I'm excited to talk about your new book. By the way, your new book, this is going to be a fresh release now, 2024. We're talking about Church on Trial: How to Protect Your Congregation, Mission, and Reputation During a Crisis. I would love for you just to kick off there. What's the heart behind this book? Why did you write this book?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of people don't know. I mean, as you know, Virgil, I'm a media producer. I'm a filmmaker. I've been doing this for a very long time and consult and advise churches and ministry organizations how to use the media more effectively. Because of that kind of reputation I've gotten over the years, for about 25 years, I'm the guy that gets the call when a church often goes through a crisis. So it could be a crisis from the outside. Maybe they're being sued by somebody, or a disgruntled ex-church member is saying critical things to the press. Who knows? It could be a lawsuit, whatever. Or it could be from the inside. It could be the pastors had a moral failure, had an affair. A youth leader had an inappropriate relationship with a minor. Somebody's embezzled money. There's a million things that could go on. And church leaders are often caught completely, they're blindsided. They don't have any training. They don't talk about this in Bible school or seminary. And what do we do? How do we tell the congregation? Do we release a statement? Do we talk to reporters? There's just a million questions. And so I often will help churches navigate all this. And now in the last few years, we've seen so many high profile collapses, literally implosions of churches and ministries around the country, from Ravi Zacharias to Bill Hybels at Willow Creek to Hillsong to so many other big stories that we've all seen in the press. I just decided that, churches, ministry organizations need a manual. They need a guide for how to avoid a crisis if possible. And then if one happens, how to get through it successfully. And so I just poured all this over the last year into a book that's coming out, and I'm super excited about it because I think it's going to be, for the first time, I'm telling people, don't just get a copy for the pastor, get a copy for the senior leaders, get a copy for the elders, the board, because everyone on the top leadership level needs to understand how to get through something like this. Because one thing I say, Virgil, is it's not if a crisis will happen, it's when a crisis will happen. In today's social media, digital world, it's just so easy for some staff member to say something stupid online or somebody to do something inappropriate. So we just have to be ready.
Yeah, I love that. As you're talking, so many thoughts are coming to my head, to my mind. Even thinking about small things to big things. Here's my first question, and then obviously we're going to unpack some of the
Sure.
ideas and thoughts, maybe on a surface level, because your book is going to be packed full of great insights
Yeah.
and advice. My first question is from your experience, right? You're the guy that people call when they're in trouble, right?
Yeah.
Um, would you say, from your experience, that most churches and pastors they have an idea of what to do, or would you say, generally speaking, they're kind of lost because this isn't you don't
Yeah.
people don't go through this in seminary or ministry school, and you don't exactly sign up for a class, before you open a plant a church. What would you say? Would you say, from your perspective, how prepared or ready are churches and pastors for this type of thing?
Not at all. Most churches aren't prepared at all. I mean, I've seen a few large churches that may have an attorney on staff or attorney on retainer, and they'll call him or her and get some advice immediately. But it's interesting, and I always say, your first call should be to an attorney, no question. Have them
Mhm.
on speed dial. There's no question about that. But your next call should be to a communication person. And I'll tell you why, Virgil. This is so important. An attorney is important because there's so many liabilities, so many legal issues, so many reporting issues today. Nowadays, if a minor is involved, you have to report it to the authorities. No, doesn't matter what the family says, doesn't matter what
Right.
anybody says, you have to report it. Attorneys are familiar with that. However, I've seen cases where a church or a ministry won in court, but their reputation was trashed. And a communication
Mm,
person is going to help you get through this and keep your reputation, if possible, keep your reputation intact. They know what to say, how to say it, when to say it, who to talk to. There's so many issues surrounding that. That's not a legal thing. It's more of a community. How do we communicate our response and what's going on here? And I think both of those things are important. But churches, like you say, are pretty much blindsided. Outside of an attorney, they have no idea what to do.
yeah. Now, obviously, there's obvious crises that kind of come to mind when you think of the churches and
Yeah.
pastors. Could you just name a few of the types of crises? You can name the obvious ones, but maybe a
Yeah.
few other ones that maybe some pastor leaders are like, I never thought about that. That kind of
Oh
situation that
yeah.
we have.
What's funny about this is sad funny, but what's interesting is often it's the most trusted person on the staff that creates the problem. For instance, there was a
Wow.
church in the South just a month or so ago, a church in the South, a secretary who was the bookkeeper for the church, been there forever, been there like decades, the most trusted person on the staff. They discovered a check bounced. And when they started investigating, they discovered she'd embezzled almost $400,000 from the church over the last 5 or 6
Wow.
years. She paid for a couple
Mm,
cars. She paid for a college education for a kid. She paid for a new house. It's just remarkable what she's been doing with this. Now, here's the thing: the church, she'll have to repay it back, and she's probably going to go to jail. However, she can't repay that back. She spent all that money, and so what'll
right.
happen is the church is gonna have to close. And that's the big burning thing with me is when a perpetrator does something, whether it's a pastor or a youth leader or worship leader or somebody else on staff,
Hmm.
I'm not so concerned about them. Let the law deal with them. I'm concerned about the church. How do we get through this? How do we keep the church healthy? How do we help it emerge on the other side? So it just really saddens me when somebody does something that would cause a church to close. They can't possibly even stay open and pay their bills. So there's some real tragic stories out there along that line. And there's an enormous number of stories of, we've seen the Catholic Church controversies of the last 10 years,
Yeah.
with all the pedophile problems and issues they've had. And that's still
Mm,
going on in so many, evangelical churches around the country. There's still those issues out there. So I think it's just a wide range of things. I know one church called me the other day that they had a bookkeeper that got upset, got frustrated, and left. She took all their financial records and she's slowly leaking those financial records to the press. And out of
wow.
context, some of them are embarrassing. So it's just interesting how it, these crises happen from all over the place. I was telling a pastor the other day that if you're leading a church that's actually making an impact in your community, chances are there's an ex-church member or an ex-employee that's got a Facebook page or a blog for the sole intent of criticizing your church. It just happens, and you're going to get critics. The question is, how do we respond?
Yeah, yeah. And the
Yeah.
tricky part nowadays, Phil, is that nowadays Honestly, anybody can say anything at any time, whether it's true or or not true. So you one of
Yeah,
the parts of your new book, one of the parts of your new book is creating a positive culture as a defense against crisis. In other words, kind of like
yeah,
how to prepare and position the church to be in a good place for if and not if when something happens, be best prepared. Can you talk a
yeah.
little bit about that?
Yeah, there's a number of things that are really, really important. I met a pastor a number of years ago in Chicago who told me he had a real heart for integrity for his staff. And so when he remodeled the office part of his church building, he put in a glass window and a glass door in every room in the building. And he said, I just don't want to have a place where anything wrong could happen. I don't want any hanky panky going around. I don't want anybody
Yeah.
fooling around. He said, I want to make it invisible or visible. And when I
Mhm.
remodeled our office building here in Los Angeles for our team at Cook Media Group, I did the same thing. I took his advice and I put a window and a glass door in every room. And a lot of people, Virgil, will say, yeah, but if they're going to have an affair, they'll do it somewhere else. Actually, that's not true. In my experience with all the churches I've dealt with and ministries I've dealt with over
Mm.
the years, almost every case starts at the office. I mean, look, you're there
Wow.
8 hours a day, sometimes longer. You're working with a small team. Maybe there's one particular person you're working with especially hard, and you're launching Christmas or Easter or a new book or a sermon series, and you're spending a lot of hours with this person. And one thing leads to another, and one thing develops. And there's that Billy Graham rule people talk about, which actually is the name of it is the Modesto Manifesto. Billy Graham and his team early in their career got together in Modesto, California at their crusade and outlined a number of things they would live by in order to keep integrity paramount in their ministry. And one of them was, I will never be alone in a room with a woman other than my wife. And it's true in a ministry with a woman, being in a room with another man other than her husband. And it's taken some criticism recently because, the chances are Billy Graham dealt with it by keeping his door open so his secretary could look in all the time. But there
Uh-uh.
wasn't much privacy there. And women rightly complain that, well, if I can't have alone time with a boss, I'm never going to move up in my career. The guys on staff can, but I can't. But you know what? The
Right.
glass door, the glass window, that solves that problem because behind glass, you can be private. Nobody hears your phone conversations or your meeting, but they can see what's happening in there. So I just think that for some people, it sounds silly, but I can't tell you how many cases I've dealt with over the years where something started behind a closed and locked door. And if you're listening to this podcast and you're a pastor or a ministry leader, I'd immediately start making some calls because it doesn't
Mhm.
take much. Just replace a door with a glass door. And I'd immediately start doing that. So that's an important thing. A second big thing I recommend, Virgil, is be more aware of red flags. It's really interesting. I have a kind of a rule when I'm dealing with a crisis in a church or a ministry that when we're in the middle of it, I'm not going to think about how it happened or where it came from or why it happened. I just want to solve the problem. I want to get that church or that
Mhm.
organization through the crisis. But once it's over, once things have kind of calmed down or getting back to normal, I always get the team and sit them down and say, okay, now knowing what you know now, looking back over the last year or 2 years, are there red flags that you see that you should have noticed back then? And I'll tell you, in pretty much every case, they tell me, oh, absolutely. Now I understand why he was doing that. And now I understand why she was doing that. And I think that if we could just be more aware of red flags, and red flags happen in a multitude of ways. It could be that staff member that comes in the morning and just strangely looks like he's got a hangover, but we don't say anything about it. Or it could be that youth leader that's spending just a little too much time with that one kid in the youth group. It could be a female staff member coming in with bruising, and she says, no, I just fall a lot, but it just doesn't look right. And in a church
Mhm.
environment, we don't want to accuse, we want to be very sensitive, which is good. But at the same time, we should be really thinking about this. And I'm big that we shouldn't do false accusations. We don't want to become cops,
Mhm.
for everybody's behavior. But at the same
Mhm.
time, I think if we could be aware early on of red flags and just maybe if we see something, go to a senior leader and say, I'm seeing this with Bob. I don't know if I should be concerned, but I wanted to let you know. Those kind of red flags can really avert a disaster down the road. So those are just a few of the little things. I think if I would say
Yeah.
anything else would be probably be careful about emails. Be careful about your finances. I have a system in our company at Cook Media Group where I have at least 3 people in my office that have access to my emails, my calendars. When I come in from a trip, I give my receipts to my assistant. She organizes them. She gives them to our producer who catalogs them, and then to our CPA who goes through them and then bills clients for expenses or whatever. And with that many people looking at my email, my calendar, my finances, it would be pretty hard for me to set up an inappropriate relationship with somebody.
Mhm,
And I
mhm.
find that email is more important than we think. I spoke at a big conference in South Africa a number of years ago. And about a month after I got back, I got an email, a very provocative email from a woman who was very attractive because she included a photo. And it was a very provocative email. She had attended that conference. And I immediately showed it to my assistant who had access to my email anyway. I showed it to my wife and I had my assistant respond. And it's interesting that once that girl found out my female assistant is reading all my emails, we never heard from her again. So I
Right.
think email can be so important because very often, if you're a leader, you're going to get an unwanted email from an admirer, maybe a text message. My advice is
Mhm.
A, don't respond at all, because even if you respond in a negative way, it could be construed in a court of law later that you encourage the relationship. So I always have my assistant respond if we respond at all. And I think that's so little things like that can really make a big difference and avert something significant happening down the road.
Yeah, that's good. I know that your wife and my wife have this issue because we are so you and me, we're so good looking that
Well,
people
oh yeah, it's a huge problem. Huge problem.
so Phil, walk me through this.
Sure.
And I know that there's pastors leaning in right now. There's leaders leaning in right now. Everybody's leaning in. Um, we have I'm calling you. We have a current situation that is definitely a crisis that could have major
Yep.
implications that affect the church, that affect the people, everything. Um, what, how do you, what are some of the steps to begin to navigate through this process and this journey, which obviously we don't know how long it's going to be and all of the implications,
Yeah.
but from your experience, what are some of the things that you start to tackle?
Well, like I said before, first call to an attorney, second call to me or a communications person in your area, somebody that you know and trust and feel comfortable with. I always say also be prepared. In my book, I actually have a plan, a crisis plan that you can implement the minute something happens. And it's pretty detailed. We don't have time to go over it here, but
Mhm.
studies show that organizations that have a crisis plan in place always emerge better on the other side. It's just an amazing statistic. They almost always emerge better. So if you can have, my book will have that crisis plan, get it
Yeah.
and really go over that with your senior team. I think that's important. A couple other things that are important is be honest and don't try to cover it up.
Mm,
When you're asked about it, when reporters call or you have to explain to your congregation, you often think, well, I'm going to cover some of it up because I don't want to hurt their feelings or I want to protect the church. Let me just say, covering anything up will come back to bite you later. It will always come back
mhm,
to haunt you later.
mhm.
So now here's the thing. You don't have to go into all the gory detail. Just be honest, tell the truth that you know at the time. I'm reminded in the book of Acts and Peter was explaining to the disciples what happened to Judas after he had committed suicide. And he didn't go into gory detail. But he was very honest. He told them exactly how Judas committed suicide, told them what happened, what the result was, but he didn't go into any gossip or gory detail, but he was honest. So I always believe in never try to cover things up. Never,
Mm,
never lie. It will always come back to haunt you. I'll also say, if it's an accusation, maybe someone's accusing the pastor of an inappropriate relationship or a youth leader or a worship leader. If there's some kind of an accusation and there's a potential victim involved, no matter how much you may believe the pastor and disbelieve the accuser, always make an effort to get the accuser heard, get them counseling, get them therapy, whatever they may need, because later on, I can recall just a couple major, you probably remember a couple big church and ministry stories in the last year or two where a woman made an accusation against a pastor in one case, and a woman made an accusation against a ministry leader in another case. And these were mind blowing because nobody could imagine that these two leaders could ever be involved in something like this.
yeah.
And so they
Mhm,
circled the wagons and they really went after these two women. They
mhm.
tried to embarrass her, discredit her, only a few months later to discover she was exactly right. And it was so embarrassing for them. In the case of the church, the entire board and most of the leadership team resigned. They were so embarrassed by it. And so always, just go in like Switzerland. Certainly you want to defend a pastor if you believe he's innocent, or a youth leader,
Sure.
or a worship leader, or a staff member. However, treat the accusation seriously, because until the investigation happens, you just never know. So never be caught, in the attitude of that you kind of try to disrespect a woman or a man, somebody that's making an accusation. Never be in that situation. That's important. And I would think that also, if the allegations do turn out to be true, say it's a pastor, for instance, you always want to get rid of sermons, books in the bookstore, online material, anything of that pastor or leader you want to get rid of, because you don't want things around to remind people of the problem. So take down their website, take down their social media accounts, take their books out of the bookstore. You want to start fresh with a new leader in that role, whatever role that happens to be. You want to start fresh. So never, leave that stuff up. Always get that down as quickly as you possibly can, because that's really important. The goal here is to emerge on the other side. And so anything that keeps you from doing that, it's going to be painful to go through some of these things, but I think it's important to remember that we want to emerge healthy on the other side. So some of these things just have to be dealt with right away.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm remembering a situation that I had to lead our church with, with a staff member who just made some poor decisions, and
Yep.
and it was going back to what you said, it was probably one of our highest trusted leaders, and it was just not a good situation. Maybe at the time of this, maybe our church is not necessarily as much in the public eye, maybe as some other bigger churches,
Yeah.
but still there's always that potential. And I remember struggling personally with, well, how much do we say, and how much do we say to internally to the organization, and then if it comes up, how much do we have to kind of publicly state? And I
Yeah.
remember hearing from some of my overseers and mentors what you just said. It's important to be clear and honest without necessarily having to give every detail that's not necessary.
Yeah.
And I'm so happy that I got that advice, like you were saying, because
That's
ultimately,
right.
as you've seen a lot of these church scandals come out, a lot of times the biggest backlash and is that there wasn't honesty, or there wasn't clarity, and ultimately it's a big aspect of how people receive it. Phil, I think it's so important that not only that you wrote this book, but that you're putting some of these handles in our hands as pastors and leaders, because it's like you said, it's not if, it's a matter it's a matter of when.
Yeah.
um talk to me.
That's true. That's
When
true.
when did the light bulb turn on? I'm gonna write this book. Like were you in the middle of helping a church go through something?
Yeah, I was, but that's always happening. It seems like, tragically. But I think it was the culmination of some of these high-profile things that have happened in the last year or two that just made me realize just how. I saw a statistic recently that 27% of people that leave the church completely, that walk away from God, walk away from the church, do it because of how poorly their church handled a crisis. I've got a, I've
Wow.
got a, I give you a very specific example. I have a friend here in Los Angeles that was a fanatical attendant. She attended Hillsong Church, and she loved it, and she was thrilled with it, and she was so excited about it. But once these revelations started happening and they started going through the crisis they went through, it
Wow.
so upset her that she's not just walked away from the church, she's walked away from God altogether. And so
Wow.
I think I see that if we could solve these things, if we could handle a crisis better, um, that's 25%, 27% that's a quarter of the people that walk away, we would stop.
Wow.
So I think there's something to be said there. And once I read that, I realized, okay, we just got to have better tools for how to deal with these situations. One of the things that I have a chapter in the book on, Virgil, is sex offenders. It's
Mm.
interesting that sex offenders, that directory, that registry has exploded in the last 10 years. I went online to the sex offender registry, typed in my zip code, and I live in Los Angeles, but I type in my zip code, and I was shocked at the number of people within a mile of my house who were sex offenders. The number of them are amazing. And I would encourage pastors to go and type in your zip code, and you can find the National Sex Offender Registry online. and you'll be amazed. And so the point is, there's so many of them that they're going to start coming to your church. I mean, and we want them to come to church. Hopefully, we want God to transform their life. But they bring an interesting problem into the church, a challenge, because
Right.
first of all, the sex offender registry is so wide. I mean, it goes all the way
Mm.
from people who are hardcore evil pedophiles, searching for children to prey on, all the way to the other end where it could be two high school kids who fall in love, decide to have sexual relationship, and the minute one turns 18, he's become now a
Right.
predator. He's become a sexual offender. And
Right.
so, that's not to excuse anything, but that's just to show you how wide that range is. So when
Mm.
they come to your church, I would encourage you to get with your senior leaders. And I talk about this, and I have some resources in the book that will help. Get with your senior team and even your volunteers and really talk about this. Do a little training. While I was writing the book, I saw the story in Chicago of a really sharp church, an African American church, had a couple ushers that were just noticing a new guy that was a new visitor. He was just really eyeing a lot of the kids. He really seemed to be paying attention to kids in the lobby and walking around the church. And so they went up to him and introduced themselves and found out his name, looked it up, and sure enough, he was a sexual
Wow.
predator. He was an offender. And so the pastor they got him, they invited him in to meet with the pastor. They sat down, and I encourage pastors, sit down with an offender that wants to come to your church and draw the boundaries. They're not going to be able to work with kids, depending on what the problem is. They're not going to be able to work around women or men, depending if it's a woman, whatever. There's just got to be boundaries. And as a pastor, you should not be afraid to draw those lines in the sand. I mean, they've already committed a crime. Maybe they've paid the price to the government already. Maybe they've been to jail or prison or whatever, but they're still registered. They're still a registered sex offender, and there are boundaries they'll never be able to cross for the rest of their life. So we need to have those in church. And even in the book, I talk about maybe some attorneys suggest you have a written agreement with them. So I just want to empower pastors and ministry leaders not to cower in fear, but be bold, step up, sit down with them, welcome to the church, love on them. We want God to transform their life. However, there does need to be boundaries. And I think that's a really important issue because every church in America is going to start having sex offenders come walking in the door at some
Yeah.
point, at some time.
Yeah, that's a good point. This is kind of an off the cuff question, Phil, and obviously, I'm sure there could be opinions, varying opinions about it. But based on what you were just talking about, I run into situations, and I've talked to friends who have had situations. Sometimes there's somebody who might not even be yet on a registry, right? But you become aware of a situation, or maybe there's a repeat, or you find out that there's a repeat offense. Is it
Right.
ever appropriate or called for a church to have to say to a person, I mean, regretfully, but you're not welcome here? Because again, every situation is different, and we do want our churches to be a
Yeah.
place where, hey, a hospital for sinners. But is there sometimes an appropriate time or way? Again, this could be a tricky question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think the key thing here is with a question like that is the church has to be a safe space for everybody involved. And if for any reason
Mhm.
this person presents a potential threat, that something could happen to a kid, another adult, a woman, a man, whatever, I think there is a time to say, I'm sorry, but we just can't allow you to come anymore because there's just too much of a potential risk or a threat. And I'm not talking about just a financial risk, but I'm talking about a
Right.
safety issue. If they're not repenting, and the Bible talks about if people aren't going to repent, if they're going to turn their back on God, absolutely don't disfellowship them. And so there is a time, and I think it's appropriate to do that if they simply aren't going to come around and do what they need to do to become part of that fellowship.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I'm glad you just touched on that because we've actually been in a situation where we really had to get to this point. Again, it's regretful and it's not the desire and it's not the plan,
Yeah.
but I think sometimes there are moments that like you said, you have to set some boundaries, and
Yeah.
maybe, and after 1, 2, or 3 communications, um, ultimately we're responsible for the safety and the care of the people that we are
Yeah.
serving. I love this, Phil. I love that you wrote this book. Um, you say church on trial, uh, because the funny thing is a lot of times people will end up in trials, but
Yeah.
so many times it doesn't go to trial, in court, so to speak, but it goes to the trial of public,
Opinion.
opinion.
Yeah,
And
that's
and so
absolutely
can
true.
you just, as we're on the tail end, can you just share like why this is so important, and what you want to see for the future of the church in regards to this topic?
Well, it's interesting. Another reason I wrote the book is because I just talked to so many people who have left the church and said why would I want to go to a church with pastors who prey on young people, or why do I want to go to church where a youth leader is having an affair? That's what they will always throw back in your face. And I just feel so strongly that if we could fix this problem, if we could at least make it shrink it a little bit, it says something to our witness to the world. It really does. It completely destroys our witness when we're doing these things that are just so inappropriate, so wrong, so illegal in some cases. We just have to get a handle on this.
Mm,
And so, human nature being what it is, we are all fallen creatures. Sin will happen. People are going to do stupid things. But if we're ready to
mhm.
deal with it right away, I think we can mitigate the problems at such a level. And I'm not talking about hiding. I'm not talking about protecting anybody. In fact, I'm totally against circling the wagons and protecting a perpetrator. I do not believe in that at all. I believe we need to get the
Right.
facts out here and deal with it appropriately. So I think if we can do that, the earlier we can do it when a crisis starts to happen. And let me just say, as we start to close, I would encourage pastors out there to be a marriage focused church. It's interesting that we've done some wonderful things for singles over the last 10 or 20 years in churches. And I think it's wonderful. And I want to continue that. However, some churches I know have gone so far with singles, they're starting to, they're starting to lose track of the married people in their church,
Mhm.
and building them up and supporting them and motivating them to keep a great marriage. When you look at the statistics out there, I just think most of the hot button issues in our culture deal with sex, identity, gender, or marriage. Almost all of them deal with those issues. And if we could become known as the one group in America that has the most amazing marriages, that has the most incredible
Yeah.
families, I think even the most anti-Christian among them, I think people that say, I don't want to have anything to do with this Jesus, or I'm not sure about this whole Christianity thing. However, I want that kind of marriage. I want that kind of family. I think it could be
Yeah.
in the world we live in, knowing what the hot buttons are in our culture right now. I think that could be our single greatest evangelism tool. If we started focusing on building a marriage friendly church, I just think it could, I'm not exaggerating when I say it could literally change the world, because it's such an important issue in the culture we live in today.
Yeah, that's good. I'm going to ask you in a moment here, Phil, to share a little bit about where people can get this book, where they can connect with
Sure.
you, find more resources. But as you're talking right now, I'm even thinking from the perspective of a leader, right? Of a pastor. I'm thinking of kind of maybe the finance directors of churches or human resource leaders. Like I'm thinking, are there things we can implement in an annual review where we open the space for our staff and our leaders to mention, hey, have you noticed any red flags anywhere in the church? I wonder if we open the door
Yeah.
for that kind of feedback intentionally,
That's
it
a
could help us get on the
That,
front end.
that's a wonderful question. I spoke this past weekend to a network, a pastor network in South Texas, and one of the issues we discussed was we need to create a culture in our church where our leaders aren't afraid to call us out if we make a mistake or do something appropriate. I find so many churches where it's the boss's way or the highway. It's nobody questions the pastor, nobody questions the ministry leader. And it's not always because the pastor's a jerk. Sometimes the pastor is a jerk, I have to say, and he doesn't want
Right.
anybody questioning his decisions. However, in more cases, I've discovered it's a respect issue. I was at one church where the pastor had to step down because of a long-term affair, and I realized that his leadership team probably noticed red flags, but I looked at the people on his team, and most of them had been saved through his ministry. A couple, their marriage had been put back together through his ministry. One guy had been through a drug and alcohol rehab program that his church launched, that he created. And they just had such respect for this pastor. You know, my team is, I'm not a spiritual leader. I'm a media producer. So my team feels perfectly comfortable calling me out on anything they think is dumb. You know, they're happy to call me a moron. And it's annoying, but I'm thrilled with it. I'm so happy that they're willing to do that because it protects me from so many stupid things. So pastors, you know, certainly your team needs to be respectful. They need to be humble, but sit down with them and remind them that you want to create a climate and a culture where people aren't afraid to speak up and say, Pastor, I'm not sure that decision is the best. Or, Pastor, I'm not sure you should go for that ministry tour for 2 weeks overseas by yourself. You know, take your wife, take an associate. There's just places that your team sees, things that your team sees that you may not see, and that would make a big difference. So that culture of, you know, being frank and honest is
Mm,
so important.
I love that. Phil, where can people get the book? Where can they connect with you, get more resources? I'm sure the book is going to come along with some additional resources, maybe some kind of masterclass, study guide type thing.
Yeah, I'm working on the masterclass now, and it'll be coming out soon. The book, everything with me is related to philcooke.com. I'm Cook with an E, philcooke.com. I would encourage you. My blog is there, and I'm writing on these kind of issues all the time. You can get my book, any of my books from there. Of course, it's available. It'll be available on Amazon and other places as well, and through AVAIL. You can go get it through AVAIL.
Hmm.
Their journal is amazing, and it'll be
Hmm.
having advertisements for it there. But it's going to be about everywhere. And, you know, it's not a mainstream book. It's not a book that everybody's going to want. But if you're a pastor, a leader in a church, or a leader in a ministry, or a board member, an advisor, consultant, you need to get this book. Mark it up, make notes, you know, dog ear it, because it's going to, if a crisis happens, if this stuff is inside you already, you'll be in a much better position to make a real impact and help solve the problem. So I just encourage people, go out and get the book right away. And I'm very grateful to you, Virgil, for talking about it. This is fantastic.
Yeah, and I want to mention you might be leaning in, listening right now, or watching, and you might say, "Well, I'm not the lead leader, or I'm not maybe in that position, but maybe you love your pastor enough to say, I'm going to buy this book
Yeah,
for him, you know, or I'm going to buy
great
this book
idea.
for the main leaders of the church, you know." I
Great
mean, think
idea.
about that. I can't remember, Phil. I can't remember when a general lay member of my church gave me a book thinking about how I can better steward and lead and be prepared for. I mean, that's an awesome idea. Hey, do that for your pastor.
Yeah,
Get
that's
a few
true.
copies for the leadership team and bless somebody.
Great.
I'll mention the Avail
Yeah,
Journal. Phil just mentioned it.
yeah,
He mentioned the Avail Journal. Phil's been on the cover of the Avail Journal. He's got articles in the Avail Journal. We love it, Phil. If you're not doing it yet, I want you guys to connect. Get our free trial subscription
yes,
by going to availjournal.com. Phil, I know you love the Avail Journal.
absolutely. It's fantastic. If you're a leader, you got to have it. It's required reading. No question about it.
As we close off the conversation, Phil, what do you want to leave as kind of a final nugget, a final thought, or final encouragement?
You know what? I kind of go back to the idea of red flags. You know, just be more aware. So often we're in a church or a ministry situation where our pastor couldn't possibly make a mistake like that, or that youth leader we have, he just came out of seminary, he's on fire for the gospel. You know, and so we don't pay attention. And again, you're not looking for behavioral problems. You're not a cop. You're not going to do any. We don't want to do any false accusations. But at the same time, just be aware of the people around you. I do it in my office. I do it with my team. I just always want to be aware because you just never know what people are going through. You never know what they're struggling with. And very often I've discovered in the work that I've done with churches in these crisis situations, a crisis happens simply because it was actually an event. You know, they say, uh, adultery is not really about sex. Embezzlement is not really about money. There's something underlying that's happening that's
Yeah.
driving people in this direction. And just the more we can be aware, love people, care about them, notice things, I think it'll make a healthier environment.
Yeah, that's good. It's funny that you say that because almost every time that anything has come up, even smaller things that wouldn't be maybe a major crisis, but when things come up, my wife and I often find ourselves saying, I always thought there was something off about that. Or
Yeah.
I always felt like there, why was he doing that? Or why was she going, right? There always seems to be that, but I guess we want to have the best, we want to have the best thoughts of people and maybe, but we
Yeah, we
have to
do.
have those eyes open for red flags. Phil, I just want to say on behalf of our Avail team, Dr. Sam Chand, Martijn van Tilburg, everybody behind the scenes here. We want to tell you,
Sure.
we honor you, we bless you. We're thankful for your leadership and for your willingness to take out of your heart and your brain and your experiences and pour out so that more people can learn and grow. You are a great blessing, brother.
Well, you're very kind, and I really do appreciate it. And I thank you so much for helping get the word out. I'm grateful. Thanks.
Yeah, I pray for this, Phil, but I can envision and imagine in the future pastors holding your book saying, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you. This is the insight that I needed." And maybe
Oh,
you were there physically to talk to them, for them to hear your voice, but they're reading your voice by reading the insights and the wisdom and the experiences that you bring. Hey, everybody! I hope you've been encouraged. What a great talk with Phil Cooke. Phil, I hope that we're going to have another podcast. You wouldn't mind doing another one in the future, right?
I'd love to. There's some other issues with this subject that we haven't covered. I'd love to. That'd be fun.
We'll plan on that. Hey, everybody. Thanks for leaning in again for another Avail episode. Phil Cooke, he is the man, the myth, the legend. Go to philcooke.com. Remember, it's Cook with an E at the end. Get the resources. Get this book, Church on Trial. And if you're not the lead leader, but you know the lead leader and you love your lead leader and lead pastor, and buy a copy for them, buy 10 so they can share it with their lead team and their staff members. You're not going to regret that, and it's going to be a great blessing. Hey, everybody, on behalf of Avail, my name is Virgil Sierra, lead pastor of Vertical Church, your host right here on the Avail podcast. Can't wait to catch you next time. As always, where we talk about this art we call leadership here on the Avail podcast. God bless. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Avail podcast with our guest, Phil Cooke. You can find out more about Phil on social media, and you can get his book by going to philcooke.com. For more leadership resources, check us out at theartofleadership.com. And make sure to claim your free trial subscription of the AVAIL Journal at availjournal.com. As always, I'm your Avail podcast host, Virgil Sierra. Muchas gracias. Thank you for connecting with us to learn the art of leadership here at the AVAIL podcast.